If we look at this image, and let's throw some instruments in this image and see where things fall in the perspective of us being here and our ears being on these sides, right? So this is where how you best fill this space. Kick should be in the center, and you can see that the kick is a little further away. The snare is behind the kick, which is usually equally in a mix. Your cymbals should be panned far out left and right, and you can go all the way to 90, but at least to 45 degrees to give the cymbals nice width, which helps your mix sound wider. Now remember, always check your overheads first to make sure you can identify where the hi-hat and tom sounds in the overhead, and put the hi-hat in the same place as it sounds in the overhead. So in our case, I'm looking at this from the drummer's perspective. That means the hi-hat is on the left, and that's how it sounds in the overheads. Then I have my toms, which are first tom closer to the hi-hat, floor tom closer to the other side, and I'm starting to fill out this space. Now there's a shaker, and since the shaker and the hi-hat are kind of occupying similar frequency ranges, I'm going to try to put that exactly to the opposite side of where the hi-hat is. Then I'm going to add my bass, and that's also in the center. So now I'm getting a real distinction here in the center with my kick, snare, and bass. And here goes my lead vocal, also in the center. But you can see that's really close, and that's how it should sound in the mix, much closer to you. The background vocals have already been imaged or panned when we created our blend, so we want to pan those hard left and right to recreate that same blend we have already created. And they should fill the entire space all around the singer. Then we have our acoustic guitars, and as I showed you, they're actually tracked stereo, though they might not be very wide. That's why they probably sound a little closer but still have a stereo image filling this space. Now the piano is also stereo. It might not actually sound as right as it looks in this image, but certain tools can actually help us make that piano sound a little wider, like for instance EQing each side of the piano differently will give you additional imaging. Then we have our two electric guitars, and you can pan one and pan one right, and you see how all this space is starting to fill up that we're listening to. Last but not least, we have our strings, which they should be the widest in the entire song. They only come in the chorus, and another thing that happens is if they're really wide is the chorus sounds bigger than the rest of the song, which is really something you want to do. You want to always lift the mix in the chorus. And this is now the example of how the mix can look overall for your spacing. Now, strings wide, acoustic guitars could be opposite side. Remember, your sound effects should be big, so they should be wide. And they're already stereo, so we really don't want to make them mono. Now, I love to add a delay, eighth note delay, to all my lead vocals. Very kind of low in the mix, but always mono and centered right under the vocal. Most reverbs should be panned hard left and right. Now, there's an unless behind that word, because there are certain tricks where it actually sounds better to stay mono. For instance, snare plate most of the time sounds good in stereo, but if you ever experiment with a shorter snare plate, very short and mono, you will actually see that it gives the snare a body that sounds more natural in mono. Things in the same frequency range should be panned to opposite sides. So for instance, you would not want to take the scrubbing nylon guitar and the hi-hat and pan them both left, because they both contain rhythmical high frequency information. Exactly the opposite is what should be applied. That means you put them on opposite sides, or leave certain instruments that give your mix natural width. That means things that are actually tracked stereo, and spread them out as far as you can. Now remember, overheads anywhere from 70 to 100% wide. You don't have to go all the way. I personally love it. It gives my mix a great width. Kick should be centered, live snare should be centered, but because the overheads contain snare and because the overhead snare is not centered, we have to take the individual snare and slightly offset the individual snare track to the opposite side of how the snare sounds in the overheads to pull it back towards the center. Very finely, maybe 5 to 7 should be the pan number. You have to experiment with it. So that means you have to solo your overheads, listen to it, identify what side the snare pulls to, take your individual snare top and bottom track and both slightly pan them over to the other side. The hi-hat should be panned to overhead position as well as the toms and the floor tom. Bass should be center, lead vocal should be center, background vocals panned hard left and right. Play around with the placement of the electric guitars. Far out to the center, 45 degrees, all these spaces. One thing that has to be considered is how it translates into mono. Now, Pro Tools does not come with a particular plugin that lets you listen to your mix simply by pushing a button into mono, unless you have something like the S1 Imager or you downloaded the stereo tool, and that will actually give you different options. But if you don't have that option, here's one that can actually give you that opportunity to check for mono compatibility. Instead of all your sub-mixers and effect channels routing directly to the master, you would create an additional stereo aux track that you route all your sub mixers and effect outputs through. You will label it submaster, and then it's a submaster output of all the sub channels, and all the effect channels will go into that aux. Now that stereo aux is different than the master fader because it gives you a pan left and right. Another plus to actually use this is that if you actually fade in Pro Tools, which I don't do, I always fade my mixes once they are bounced down if needed in mastering. But if you want to fade in Pro Tools and you actually apply mastering plugins on the master fader, the problem is that lowering the volume will also change how much volume gets into the actual plugin and therefore change how they react on lower levels, completely changing the sound. So if you are fading in Pro Tools with automation, it's recommended to actually put your pre-mastering plugins, compression, limiters, and other things on the submaster, not on the master fader. This master fader doesn't have a pan, but the aux does. So all we have to do to listen to mono is take the two left and rights and pan them both towards the middle by simply clicking on them by clicking with option. Now you hear how your song will sound in mono. Now you can also, if you have the stereo tool, simply take the width and move it over to the left from 0 to -12. Now these numbers don't make any sense to me, but if you try it out, you will hear how it becomes mono. If you have the S1 Imager in waves, if you are allowed to use waves, again check with your instructor, then you simply take the width section and pull it down. Now why listen to mono? Well, if you think about it, most clubs, AM radio, and live venues are still in mono. Why are they in mono? Because clubs, for instance, don't want the people on the left side of the club to hear a different sound than the right side of the club. AM radio simply does it for bandwidth reasons, and live venues or performances usually have mono systems for several reasons. One, obviously, that the entire audience should hear the same sound, but also because it takes less channels on the console to run everything in mono. Overpanned sounds may completely disappear when you're in mono. So it's something that if you have, for instance, your strings panned so they show up in the stereo tool wider than left and right, then in mono they will have a significant drop in volume. So now everything is imaged. We understand EQ, compression, and imaging. We'll have to talk about time-based. And what is the purpose of actually using reverbs? Well, whenever you make a sound, wherever you are surrounded by reverb almost all the time, even on the outside, which is so far away that you probably won't hear it, but it is there. It gives us the illusion of actual space and depth in the mix. And it's just an illusion, because we're recreating something that would naturally occur. It also sometimes helps us frequency-wisely to cover some areas that we might have not properly addressed. So it has two functions, but you can also see that overusing them can also cover things up that we've previously cleared up. But it creates a perception of distance, which also, by the way, levels adjustments will do the same thing. They will also change the perception of distance. But things that should be closer to you will have a shorter pre-delay and reverb time than things that are further back. So how do you find the right level? And I'm not even going to get into is what is the right reverb for what sound, because there's really no rule. It's really up to you. I can only tell you that what I personally prefer for certain things are, for instance, chambers for guitars, acoustic or electric. Very, very short rooms for drums, and sometimes for toms, bigger rooms. For snare, plates, short plates. For vocals, I like delays and plates. For pianos and strings, I like halls. So it all depends, but this is kind of like the style of mixing that I do. And after a while, you kind of figure out what you like. Not saying that I have not used a hall on the vocal, because, it obviously works in some cases. For instance, on big gospel songs, I've used 4.5 second church halls, and it works for that. But you have to experiment. What is more tricky is actually how much of it to use. So my trick is to first start by properly setting up the send, labeling it properly to the reverb, obviously, and then labeling the reverb track itself. And auditioning by slowly raising that send fader with everything playing until I think it is too loud. And I'm going to remember what that level is. Then I slowly lower it to a level where I can't hear it. So now I found my maximum and my minimum level, and I will now go back and forth until I hear it, but it is not too present. And that is usually the right level. Now, there are some advanced techniques that we will get into a little bit more in the micro mixing, but I want to throw it out for some of you that are already feeling very comfortable with mixing, is for instance, ducking reverbs. Now, ducking, as we know, is a dynamic processing method that involves a compressor and a sidechain. For instance, ducking the reverb on the vocal with the vocal being the sidechain. That way, every time the singer sings, the reverb is slightly compressed, slightly, I must say, it's very important. And then as soon as the singer stops, the compression goes. It gives you the perception of more reverb than you actually hear while the singer is singing, because as soon as they stop, you hear the reverb. So you're able to use a little more of the reverb without it distracting you from understanding what the singer is saying. I also often like to build natural rooms before I send them to a hall, especially on vocals. So a simple plate and hall often doesn't work because the recording itself is already missing that natural ambience that a beautiful recording studio has, because it was recorded too close or in a room that was too tight. So I create that first. So I send the vocal to a small room, 300 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, ambience or room, very, very, very small, with hardly any pre-delay. And I add a little bit of that. Then I send in pre-fader mode this time out of this hall into the reverb with 0 pre-delay, because that little room becomes my pre-delay. So that 200 millisecond room is now my pre-delay for the hall, creating what is called early reflections that some of these reverbs don't give you enough control over, because each one of those can be individually compressed and EQ'd and really create a more natural ambience of how you would hear a singer standing in a beautiful club or concert hall. Another thing that you can do is take some of your delays and actually throw the output, don't throw the output, and send from the delay into the reverb to give it a little bit more depth. Big one for me is EQing reverbs and delays. I think that's really what refines your mix and improves the overall separation and distinction dramatically. And then really automating the sends to the reverbs is a powerful tool to create separation between sections of the songs, where you might not hear much of the snare plate in the verses, but I raised that send 2 dB in the choruses, and now I just uplifted the chorus. So anything I can do in the slightest, almost inaudible way to enhance one section or separate one section from the other, I will do. Little bit more reverb on the vocal in the chorus, little bit more snare plate, drier verses, bridge, automating into big reverbs like we will do in this project, are things that create excitement and keep the listener involved. Very linear mixes are often, no matter how good the song is, are often bypassed by the listener because they get bored. So you have to create excitement at certain intervals through your mix. So let's take a look at the actual project. First, look at your assignment, and you will see in the reference section and this particular assignments page several PDFs and videos that are there for your review. APT Mixing is a document that I wrote explaining some of the differences between mixing in different genres. There's also an original, some of these documents are from DRP, repetition for you, which I'm a big believer in repeating things over and over to really get them to stick. I will learn the same way. And there are some things like dynamic processing PDF, practical mixing, automation is something I wrote new, just a little breakdown. If you don't remember how certain things in automation work, that might be a quick little 2-page thing you can look at. And then improving your studio environment, because that's very essential part in actually being able to create a great mix, is having an environment that translates the sound appropriately so it sounds good everywhere. There's also additional videos. Some of them you might be familiar with: equalization, time-based processing, practical mixing, the mix session, dynamic processing application, improving your studio environment, are all from DRP. So long time ago you've seen those, and it might be helpful for some of you that really struggle with mixing to revisit those before you get started. And then I made one for basic principles of compression that kind of shows you how to measure a waveform and kind of figure out what the correct attack and release times are. Now, once you start on your project and you already have a good blend, take your time to do each step that you see in this assignment slowly. Make sure that you understand each and every step before you get going. Feel free to contact me if you're unsure about anything. And then find the right plugins. Some of you have a wave bundle, which you can use if you're one of my section student, and maybe some other things that your instructor approved. So it's always the question, which EQ do I use? Well, usually you can stay with EQ7, which works fine. But if you have other options, there might be reasons to use them, and you want to think about that. Now, for our exercise and practice, what this mix basically is, I want you to compress and EQ every sound. But it is not usually necessary in a mix to do that, and I want you to be aware of that. If you follow this process and you really take it step by step, you can do very well. This grading on this project is mostly based on completing tasks and how grade your mixes is really only a small percentage of the grade. So do not, again, use any other plugins except what has been bundled with Pro Tools unless you have the permission of your instructor, which you know, you obviously know by now who your instructor is. And just check with them and make sure. Open the session from the last project and save it immediately back into the same folder as last name first name macromix-mst. Then, since we've already blended, we want to recheck our blend, make sure that our main output is hitting between 10 and 12 dB, and you want to maybe make some of the changes that you received from the review of your last project. I'm sure there's some comments in there. Make sure your kick is loud enough and other things that I might mention to you or your instructor mentioned to you, and apply those things immediately before you do anything else. If your overall volume is too high, it's very simple to go ahead and make a group of all your audio tracks and lower them together without lowering the subgroup or effect channels, by the way, which always have to stay at their unity gain. Your master output level should not exceed the low yellow, which is right around -10 dB to -12 dB. So remember, adding the plugins on the individual tracks will increase our volumes automatically, and mixing is a constant change. So when you start EQing things and you hear things changing, you will automatically start reblending throughout the entire process. So start with compressor and EQ on all the drum tracks. Now, which one goes first? The lifelong debate between engineers. It's usually compression before EQ, but it's not always the case. Sometimes I like to EQ before I compress, depending on what I hear. If I hear a particular problem with a sound that I want to address before I compress it, then I will EQ first. So make that decision on your own. I'm not telling you either or. You don't have to use separate compression and EQ. If you're in Pro Tools 10 or 11, you can use channel strip. If you have downloaded the free Eventide Ultra effect, which has compression and EQ in one plugin, if you have anything like this and it's approved by your instructor, you are welcome to use one. You don't have to, that doesn't have to be separate. Now, make each sound adequate by using the method that I described earlier, by attenuating something that does not sound good, and by shaping and raising and gaining something that needs a little support. Don't overdo it. Often you should max out at 4 dB, and most of the times it won't even need that much. Sometimes 2 dB at a wider Q range will actually help a lot and improve the sound. And all we're trying to do in the macro mixing is just make this little improvement one time through all the tracks. So after you did the drums, do the bass, the guitars, the keys, the pads, the vocals, pretty much everything. Now remember that they have to work together. So if you cue one thing and there's other instruments in that occupy the same frequency range, to try to already think about your separation and apply the EQ that's slightly different than the other instrument. Every instrument except kick, bass, and sub should have a high pass filter set around 50 to 75 Hertz, not higher, not lower. Now, next step you should do is apply sense. Now, we already have the effect channel set up, so it's fairly easy to go ahead, and if you want to add a little reverb to the snare, to go to your sense, pull up the bus that sends to the snare plate, which should be labeled properly by now, and simply raise it. Make sure you turn the blue P off. You do not want to send in pre-fader mode. And use the method, bring it up till it's too loud, bring it down till you can't hear it, and find just the right amount of that snare plate. Then repeat that same step until every effect has at least one instrument sent to it. So I would do a snare plate, I would do a guitar ambience, add some hall to the piano and string, add the vocal plate and the eighth note delay to the vocal, add the quarter note delay to the electric guitars, and the ambience, guitar ambience to the acoustic guitars. Add a little bit of drum room to the toms, and I think that was all of it. And then the special effect ones, special effect Hall and special effect delay, we will address in a second. Now, you can also send from the submixer, which in our case we will only do for the special effect sense that we will discuss in a little bit. So every track should at least have one or more audio tracks sending signal to it, right? So does not mean that every track has to have a send on it. No, it's the opposite. Every effect channel should have one instrument sent to it. And don't overdo it. A little bit goes a long way. Effects are supposed to be felt, create depth and a perception of depth, not really heard, unless you want it in a particular section. Now again, leaving sends in pre-fader mode is not allowed unless it is for very specific reasons. It makes it very hard for somebody to solo and listen to individual things when the effects are playing the entire time. Plus, by pressing the P, you're actually disconnecting the send level from the main fader. That means any adjustments you make level-wisely to the main fader will not be reflected in the amount of reverb that you will hear. So, no P, no pre. Make sure you take those off. Next step, let's apply some dynamic processing to our lead vocals and background vocals. All three tracks, the two leads and the background vocals, should have a little bit of EQ, slight compression not exceeding 3 to 4 dB, and a de-esser very light, again not exceeding more than 3 or 4 dB of gain reduction. And this will really help you. Now remember, big boosts are unnecessary here. A little bit goes a long way, and your high pass filter should be, you know, around the 80 Hertz range. Don't get confused by this picture where the high pass filter is set all the way to 100. The reason for that was actually that there was AC noise that had to be eliminated. Next step, let's add a little bit of distortion to your electric guitar. The electric guitar 2, which only plays through the bridge, supposed to play a light solo behind the vocal, so make sure it's not too loud, and with a very light and warm distortion. A very bright cutting distortion will really interfere with the vocal too much. So find Sans Amp or Guitar Rig 5 or 11 free, and find play with a distortion setting that gives you a slight bite, and maybe even EQ it afterwards to take some of the highs out to keep it warm. But not too fat. Don't make it muddy either. Now, we've already discussed the panning and the imaging, and definitely something I'm going to take a look at is your live drums. They have to be appropriately panned. As you can see in this picture here, the snares are slightly panned to the other side. Then it sounds on the overheads, which overheads are fully wide. The hi-hat is where it sounds on the overheads. The toms are where it sounds on the overheads. And this is pretty much exactly what the drum panning should sound like. Although you have the option to maybe not go as wide here. You can do some things with the nylon guitars to kind of maybe narrow them a little bit if they sound too wide for you. I personally love when they sound wide, but that is completely up to you. That's a matter of taste. And then remember, you could put the shaker on the opposite head of the hi-hat. The congas can find a place. The piano does not have to be fully wide. So there's all kinds of things that can find places in your stage of mixing. Now, one of the things that we have to do is learn how to automate pans in Pro Tools, which is very different from what you are used to in Logic. Logic has, even on stereo channels, only a single pan knob, where if you take a close look at Pro Tools, you will see that stereo tracks, like our tree tracks, and trees, by the way, are a percussion instrument, have two pan knobs, one for the left side and one for the right side, which you have to literally automate separately. So to automate a tree which moves fairly fast, and a tree is, by the way, just some bells that are just struck with a drumstick from down up or up or down. Or a Mach tree would be small bells in different sizes that are swiped. So there's actually two types of bells on here. And the faster one is a standing tree. To automate that, you want to do it while most of the sound is active, not while the ring, because the ring it's going to be very hard to hear overall in the mix. But when the actual swipe on the tree happens is when most of the automation needs to happen. So if you take a quick look at this image here, the left and the right side are both starting on the left and then moving equally from left to right, whereby this one stays on the right because it is right, and this one will have to go back to the left after the sound has stopped ringing and go back to full width. So before and after our automation, we want to make sure that there are anchor points so that we can return to our full width on all the other tree spots. You can also see that the automation happens during the main action of the tree and is completed by the time it rings out. To apply this tree automation, open up your small arrow on the bottom of the track, click on pan all pan times, and you will see the automation. Now here's a fast tree, and here's another one. Here's another one. All I need you to do is to do it twice. So go ahead and use your R and T with keyboard focus engaged. Zoom in, and you will see the automation. Now you can make it bigger by pressing Control up arrow. So you can see both sides a little better. Use your hand, create your anchor points, and let's start here. And I also want to anchor it after the sound is over. I want to come back to it. And I'm going to start here, which means I'm going to have to start here. And I want to be done by here, which is right around here. So now I can simply use the trim tool to drag this area down. Now you see it's not creating the arrow that I want. I mean the linear line down. So I simply click Option and delete the point. And then bring the right side also up, and let's do that one more time. The right side also up in the same area, and if I zoom in a little bit, you can see and hopefully also hear that this is moving from right to left or left to right. We want to automate the lead vocal so it is very balanced and even throughout the mix. Now you can already look at this vocal and visually expect that there has been some processing done, which actually it has been run through Melodyne and some of the volumes have already been adjusted. So there's not a whole lot of automation. But this automation picture you see here actually displays my final micromix automation. So it does not have to be this fine, and this would actually be too much for the macromix. If you simply gain some regions to make it overall more even, that would be enough automation for the macro mix. Same with the nylon 2 guitar. The nylon 2 guitar plays little solo licks behind the lead, sometimes at the same time, sometimes coming out of a lead vocal in between a space. Those should be heard, but when it plays at the same time, it shouldn't really interfere with the lead vocal. So automating this is a little trickier than the lead vocal. And again, this would be maybe also a good spot for some ducking, sidechain compression. Then we're going to automate the special effect tracks, which comes actually from the lead submixer. And we're going to automate the background vocals just like we have to do the lead vocal. But if you followed my directions in the vocal project and you adjusted the balance for each one of the sections, you won't have to do any automation on the background vocal. All I listen for is that it is even throughout the song. Now, this automation for the special effects is going to be interesting. I'm going to give you a quick example of how this will actually sound in Pro Tools. So as you can see in this example, we are inserting 2 cents in the lead submixer, which are both in an off position and not in pre-fader mode. Then when you look at the edit window here, you can see that I've opened up 2 automation lanes, which you can simply do with the plus and minus button on the side and then resize them. you can see now the automation in this window for the special effect delay and special hall. Now pay attention to the special effect delay being very accurately going up and down, whereby the special effect hall automation is a lot more smooth coming in, because halls would sound too abrupt. Now let's take a listen to how this sounds.
You remind me of a sunset in Puerto Rico.
Now you can hear that only the word Puerto Rico is being delayed, but it's even more obvious when we listen to the second example.
The stormy love we used to make. I know that I need to let this go.
Only the word make was actually delayed. If you do it the opposite way and send continuously to the delay and unmute and mute the delay itself, you will get delays of words that wouldn't be desirable and would continuously repeat words that you wouldn't want. So this is the only accurate way to actually do this type of automation. Let's listen to the effect of the special effect hall coming in right after, and listen to how smooth it comes in when it's actually done.
You remind me of a sunset in Puerto Rico. You remind me.
Now this really gives the song a big feel and makes it really large for the end of the song. Where this brings me back to the point of doing things in the mix that bring the audience attention back to your mix. So let's talk about parallel compression. Parallel compression is one of the most powerful tools in mixing, not just for drums, but for all types of different instruments, guitars, even sometimes vocals. Snares by themselves, kicks by themselves. You can increase a lot of attack without really changing the sonic quality of the kick as drastically as compressing the original signal itself. So parallel in comparison to serial would be, serial compression means you have two compressors on one channel. But what if I want very light compression on my drum submixer? I don't want it to sound compressed, but I want to get that attack that you get from a lot of compression with the right attack time. Well, that's when parallel compression comes in. So how we start is we already set up our PC submix channel, which stands for parallel compression submix channel, that will have now a compressor plugin inserted. Then we're going to go to the live drum submixer, and we're going to send to the input of that parallel compression submix channel. Now, this send should be in pre and at unity gain. This level that's now being sent to the compressor has to be static and should never change, because once the compression is set, we don't want us adjusting the fader to change how much level goes into the compressor, therefore changing how the compressor reacts. Now this type of parallel compression should be very, very aggressive. A good thing about sending things in pre is that you can now turn off all the other submixers and even turn the volume off your live drums and just hear the compressed signal of the parallel compression channel. High ratio attacks times anywhere between 25 and 45 milliseconds and release times very fast, so you get that pop in the drums, is necessary. But what's important is to be not too careful with this. You want to get at least 5, 7, maybe even more gain reduction. You really want to hear those drums snap. It might sound way too overdone when you listen to it by itself, but your next step will simply be to turn it all the way off, bring everything else back in, and start blending it into your drums till you feel that attack, not really hearing all the compression. So let me show you this actually in the session. So this session opened here, as you can see, is a completely empty canvas. No compression or EQ has applied to it yet, but I can still show you what parallel compression can do to the live drums. So my live drums are routed through the drum sub mixer, and everything else should be routed correctly. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to mute all these tracks except those two. Okay. Then I'm going to insert a compressor here. I'm going to leave that open for now. First I'm going to set up the parallel compression sub. I'm going to use bus 3132, rename it as PC sub, and then send straight to it. This time we want to have it in pre-fader and at unity gain. Now because I'm in pre-fader, I can turn this down and hear my drums here. Now again, remember, I want this to really snap. So I'm going to play around with my settings a little bit here. I hear that it's snapping, but it's staying on too long, so I'm going to go faster. Okay, somewhere around here. Now I can back up a little bit. Remember, I always overdo it a little bit. Here before, then after. I don't have to use too much makeup gain, although I'm reducing the level by 12 dB. I'm going to try a little bit longer. Go back a little bit. Okay, I'm getting close. Okay, that's a good sound. Now it sounds very compressed. That's okay, because now I'm going to mix that into the blend of my song. Let's see what happens. Now one thing I already know, that once I get close to the level I achieve here, I'm going to have to back up these drums just a little bit.
Can't stop the river rolling down my face. You tried to call me.
And there it is. Let's check without it. It doesn't have to do a lot, but you can see that it changed the way the drums feel in the song. And they don't sound very compressed. It's an incredible technique. So remember, referencing is very essential to be successful at mixing. Comparing your mix to other mixes, which have been already successful and proven, but also to reference in different speakers, different quality of speakers, different size speakers, outside the room, inside the room, and in environments that you're used to, like your car. Your laptop speakers, for instance, will show you if your kick has enough highs, because they are incapable of producing frequencies under 100 Hertz. So just a thick kick is not going to show on your laptop speakers, which is a clear indication that your kick needs more highs. So those are the kind of things that you want to do. Headphones, cars. Now once you feel confident that your mix is almost finished, and you're ready for the micro mix, the fine-tuning stage, then you're done for the macro mixing stage. So you go ahead, you bounce down the mix to MP3 or waveform, whichever works. It really is not that doesn't make a big difference. It shouldn't take you more than 4 to 6 hours to complete this task. I used to spend 12 hours on mixes, no problem. Now I can do it in 4 to 5 hours, complete it, including macro mix. So it really gets faster, but take your time. This is a important process that once you learn it, it will make you very efficient at it. So make sure that you do not send the entire session again. So as you did in the previous project, I already have all your audio files. All I need is your session file and your MP3 or waveform of the bounds of your session. Upload those files through Gobbler. Now, my expectations are not a perfect mix, because perfect mix is what I expect after the micro mix phase. What I need now is you to be 80 to 90% there. Have especially completed all the tasks. Have a good blend. Don't use too many effects. Everything should be slightly enhanced with a little bit of compression. It makes no sense to have an EQ plugin on a track that has no settings. It also makes no sense to have a compression plugin on a track that is not reacting because the threshold is not set correctly. So apply those techniques that you have learned on every single track. I'm looking forward to hearing your mix, and I'm looking forward to seeing you applying these methods and applications that we have discussed so far. Now, if you have additional ideas, I'm completely open to you of trying things. Just make sure you clearly indicate that you did, because it's very hard for me to identify those special things in a big session like this without having to search for it. So if you want to try parallel compression on the bass, then you would apply a plugin, you would apply a compressor to this bass that is sidechained from the kick, therefore ducking the bass every time the kick hits. You can also try to automate your EQ on the vocal for the parts after the bridge where her voice gets thinner, and slightly enhance the lows a little bit, or the low mids, and reduce the highs a little bit. Try to automate some of the sends to increase and decrease certain types of effects in certain specific areas. Now, the electric guitar too sounds really good as a solo if it has a lot of delay and reverb on it and is flying way behind the lead vocal. So take that into consideration. Automating the snare play to make it a little louder in the chorus. And make sure that you do not pan the things that are supposed to be centered. Keep background vocals, pads, and strings as wide as possible. And I also want to include the overheads in that one, though it is okay to pan them in just a little bit. Mono is not acceptable. If your levels overall get too hot in your master fader after you have gone through the macro mixing stage, and you're getting over the yellow phase and you're getting into the -4, -6 dB range or hotter, you have no choice but to turn down all the individual tracks. Now, this can be done by creating a edit or mix group and lowering all the tracks, but it will not affect the tracks that have automation enabled. So you will have to go into those tracks, either use a trim plugin to trim those tracks down by the same amount that you lowered the other tracks, or go into your automation, grab the entire automation in the automation lane with Command A and lower it by the same amount. Listen when you reference to how heavy is the bass in these other songs you're listening to. How bright are their mixes? How balanced are they? What's the vocal level? And can you tell, are your instruments in your mix as distinct as theirs? And remember, this is like the most important thing in mixing that takes many years of practice. It's not about EQing each instrument so it sounds great by itself. It's supposed to make sense with everything else that's going on in the session. You can start with some presets, but at the end of the day, it's all about your ear. And you have to train your ear as much as you have to train your technical skills. So it's like you have to train yourself to hear notes. You have to train yourself to hear what frequencies are necessary to make something sound better. Listen for those sonic qualities. Now here are some examples. Obviously you have the SoundCloud link for Sweeter, which is the mix that I did in Pro Tools on your standard headphones with only Pro Tools plugins. The mix took me about 3 to 4 hours. So I didn't try to go overboard and try to create something that can't be reached. I think you can absolutely reach that level of mix easily. And if you want to go to Spotify or YouTube or something, if you don't have these songs, and look for songs like Mariah Carey's Always Be My Baby, Christina Aguilera, Keeps Getting Better, Janet Jackson's Feedback, or Single Ladies by Beyonce. Now, these are not the same type of production songs, but they are a great example for us for sonic comparisons, the highs, the lows, the level of the vocals. Now, important, do not leave any sense that are routed to a time-based plugin in pre-fader mode. Again, that little blue button should not be on except for the parallel compression. Do not move submixers from unity gain. Now, you have obviously, some of you will use unity gain, some of you will use -4. That is okay, as long as they all stay there. You can have the slight adjustments to the live drum balance to make up for introducing the parallel compression, but that should be the maximum of you changing those levels. Effect channels have to stay at unity gain, and so does your master fader. Your effect levels are not set by how high your effect channels are, but how much you're sending to it. And your master fader has to stay at unity gain. Have fun. This is a great learning experience and not something that you should rush through. Take your time with mixing. Mixing is an art. We talk about so many technical aspects about mixing and EQing and imaging and all these things, but at the end of the day, it's an emotion you are trying to evoke in your listener. So it is about making things balanced and about triggering somebody's feelings and also translating the feelings that are already incorporated in the writing of the song and how the singer is performing the song. This is as exciting to me as painting a great picture probably was to Picasso. And hopefully you can see the joy and fun in doing this because it will be a big part of your production life in the future. Have fun.